Live from Singapore, this is Insight with me, Haslinda Amin, where we dive deeper into the stories that matter with crucial context and sharp analysis. Stocks and bonds gain, and a sign that investors see Trump's pick for Treasury Secretary as a measured choice. Scott Bessent is expected to inject some stability into the economy and markets. Nvidia's Jensen Huang calls for global cooperation as he visits Hong Kong amid fears of growing tech tensions between China and the U.S. The Adani Group reassures creditors that it has enough cash after a U.S. bribery charge against it triggered a sell-off in the conglomerate stocks and bonds. And will a Trump administration be less inclined to pursue the Adanis? We assess the geopolitical calculations with the Asia Research Institute's Mahbubani. Our top story, President-elect Donald Trump is nominating Key Square Group's Scott Bessent as the next Treasury Secretary, capping an extended search for the position. Trump picked Bessent after considering a long list of candidates, including Apollo executive Mark Rowan, former Fed Governor Kevin Warsh, and Howard Lutnick, who was tapped to lead the Commerce Department instead. Bessent, who Trump describes as one of the world's foremost international investors and geopolitical and economic strategists, will play a key role in implementing his agenda, which includes sweeping tariffs and embrace of crypto. Let's get to Avril Huang with the market reaction to Bessent's nomination, and we're seeing gains, Avril.
Certainly, both in U.S. stock futures as well as treasuries, and I think it's part of this Trump trade that's kind of turned into a Bessent bet, so to speak. I mean, markets have for weeks been grappling with some uncertainty about what Trump's policy is going to mean for tariffs, inflation, spending, trade relations. Today, they are embracing Trump's pick for Treasury Secretary. Just the idea that someone with his sort of market savviness will inject stability into the economy as well as markets. So as I say, that Treasury rally quite pronounced in the Asia session. And remember, he's someone who sees the need to address government spending as well. Flip the board. Take a look at how that's playing out in the Bloomberg Dollar Index that is sliding today. Its worst decline in 3 weeks, and this follows on from a 8 weeks of advance. If we can just flip the board and take a look at this next page, that will show you how soft the dollar is looking today, and that's being something that's helpful for Asia stocks as well as some of these other Asia currencies. Certainly, Bessent is seen as somebody that takes perhaps a gradual approach to tariffs, and that's something that could be helpful for Chinese stocks as well, particularly the tech names, as we see how they've been really hard hit in the past week. About $41 billion of market cap wiped off the biggest Chinese tech names. On the Hang Seng Tech, it's 20% down from the October peak. Of course, the rollout of stimulus in China has not been helpful. Neither has these earnings calls, disappointments, and as one economist put it, you think about the business environment, it's worse than 5 years ago and even worse than in 2022 during the zero COVID policy has.
So it's a waiting game still, wanting more stimulus when it comes to China. Avril Huang, thank you so much for that. Let's get insights, perspective. Hugh Chung, Chief Investment Advisory Officer of Endowus, a digital wealth platform with more than $7 billion in client assets under advice. Hugh, good to have you with us. So a sigh of relief when it comes to the markets, right?
Yes. So I think the appointment of Scott Bessent is received positively by the market because he's viewed as a pragmatist. When it comes to policy, I mean, in the past, we've seen appointments of people from the industry and banks, such as Henry Paulson and Robert Rubin as well. So I think the market expectation is for him to be, more market friendly and take policy and tariffs in more gradual stance.
Now, the question really is, how far can this rally go? A lot has been priced in already. People were pretty euphoric when it came to Trump policies, Trump agenda, Trump team. How much more upside?
Yes, I think even before the election of Trump, the fundamentals of the U.S. economy has been quite strong. And I think that is continuing at the moment. So as you alluded to, the valuations are already very high. But I think, historically, bull markets have run longer than, what people remember. So
yeah, we're talking about a bull market of a decade, I think, already.
Yeah, no, if you count from 2009 for sure, but I think there's been kind of recesses after COVID, et cetera. So valuations are certainly high, but if you take out the US and particularly for the handful of stocks, there are areas outside within equities that are still looking pretty interesting.
So what's the next catalyst then? I mean, now that there is clarity on the Treasury position, is it going to be the PCE, for instance? I mean, what will drive sentiment from here?
I think it'll continue. I mean, it really have to continue to come down to earnings. I think the expectations for earnings are still very high. So the earnings still need to deliver, particularly for the US market. But I think for other markets outside of the US as well, we've seen more mixed reactions or mixed reports of earnings. So it has to continue to be earnings.
And how closely are you watching the PCE report coming up this week? I mean, it is key. It is the preferred gauge for the Fed.
Yeah, so if you look at the PCE, I think the expectation is somewhere around a kind of 2.7% YOY growth. If you look at the PCI that's already come out, it's been more or less in line. And if you look at some of the kind of retail numbers as well as the PPI numbers, it's been very mixed. So I don't think there will be anything that's materially different from the trend that we've been seeing from the PCE report.
But that will sway. You think the PCE will sway the Fed decision and, of course, the way, the trajectory of Fed moves?
Yeah, I think the Fed views the current kind of, policy rate to be, high compared to where they want to be. So they will probably want to cut rates over the next few policy meetings. It's very hard to say whether it's going to be December or January. But I don't think one kind of data point in PCE will necessarily change that trajectory.
Bessent, of course, has kind of shaped the bond markets. We're seeing some relief there already, and some are saying that perhaps 10-year yields could probably give up 15 basis points. I mean, where do you see yields headed from here?
Yeah, so we don't necessarily take market views on the yield, but I think what's important is that the absolute level of the 10-year is already at a pretty decent level. So for bond investors, what we advocate is that if your starting yields are high, then that gives you a cushion of income. So I think generally 10-year is probably going to gradually fall a little bit, but it's very hard to say where it's going to land. I don't think it's going to be very low, so probably around the 3.5% to 4% levels. But I think what's important is that as bond investors, you're generating stable income, and I think that's what's important as an asset class for bonds.
People talk about how Bessent has this 3-3-3 plan. 3% GDP, getting inflation down and so on and so forth. I mean, how would that square when it comes to the US dollar?
Yeah, I think compared to where the dollar is now, like you've seen today, with his appointment dollar is actually, coming down a bit. So if he's successful in getting those policies, then I think dollar will probably gradually weaken because currently I think the expectation is for inflation to be very sticky and dollar is kind of out there as well.
So that will be supportive when it comes.
That will be supportive.
Supportive of Asian
risk markets, also
and
Asia.
Also, that's right,
sure.
And EM, so on and so forth.
Yes.
So how should your portfolio be looking like as you enter 2025?
Yeah, so I think as you said, the equity markets, particularly the US, is quite high. So you want to make sure you diversify into different asset classes, including bonds and including even other asset classes out there, but also that you keep a diversification from a regional and sectoral perspective. So again, it's been very focused on US large cap tech, and that is a very, very big part of US global markets. But there are many, many other asset classes that, historically have shown to really benefit.
Such as?
Well, such as high quality bonds, but also, there are areas in equities that are quite, I would say, undervalued versus history, whether it's healthcare, whether it's biotech, and, other value kind of sectors out there are also, selectively looking at a lot of value.
Is there a sense that investors are underpricing risk right now? And what is the biggest risk out there for you?
I mean, there's definitely a concern that investors are underpricing risk. If you look at the equity risk premium, particularly for the US market, is very low, particularly compared to bonds. But I think the biggest risk, in my view, is the concentration of the market, as I say, in a handful of stocks. So the market can get pretty carried away by, and some of them are up a lot for good reason. There's real cash flow, real earnings, and there's a change in the way AI has transformed the business. But a lot of it is very future looking, and it's been priced in to perfection almost, right? So I think the concentration of the markets could potentially lead to undesired outcomes. So I think it is very important to look at other asset classes, even though they don't look as sexy as some of the other ones.
All right, Hugh, hang tight. Hugh Chung, Chief Investment Advisor Officer of Endowus. Well, still ahead this hour, Asia Research Institute Distinguished Fellow Kishore Mahbubani will be joining us to dig into how the U.S. charges against Gautam Adani may impact wider relations with India. And we'll track all the market reaction out of India with Rout Research as we count down to the open later this hour. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.
Nvidia has also benefited from being in this region, in China. We came over 25 years ago. Nvidia design centers in Hong Kong, Pudong, Beijing, Shenzhen have many proud HKUST alums and longtime colleagues who have helped me build Nvidia. They've also helped build China's technology ecosystem from the very beginning. We've had the benefit and the great joy and privilege of watching the amazing technology industry form in China.
And that was Jensen Huang speaking at a university in Hong Kong, where he received an honorary doctorate at the weekend. Let's bring in our tech reporter, Annabelle Julis, who was at the event. Belle, set the scene for us.
Yeah, well, it was absolutely a rock star event for Jensen Huang, and really just hundreds of students turning out. Of course, a lot of different journalists from various publications, but glued to basically what Jensen Huang was going to be saying in his speech, because as you can see here, he was given an honorary doctorate in engineering, and then following that he took to the podium where he, in his speech, really outlined the cause or the need for global cooperation. Nvidia as a business, of course, it's important to remember, yes, it's headquartered in the US, but it's getting a lot of its revenue from China, where it sells not the most advanced of its technology, but still a lot of its technology to the mainland. And it also has that very strong relationship with its Taiwanese suppliers like TSMC. So it's a very tight and delicate balancing act that it needs to manage. But he did really emphasize that need for harmony. Following the event, we actually had a press briefing, and I managed to get a couple of questions to him directly about how he's looking at President-elect Trump. Take a listen.
I don't know what's going to happen with the new administration, but whatever happens, we'll balance simultaneously compliance with laws and policies, continue to advance our technology and support and serve customers all over the world. We'll continue to do that, and we'll be able to do that just fine.
So it sort of follows on from the tone that we had in the earnings call last week, where Jensen Huang, in that earnings call, really pledged to continue following any US restrictions.
Belle, nice get there. You also spoke to him about Samsung and the progress it's making in having its most advanced AI memory chip certified.
Yeah, that's right. This was actually outside, and you can see all this crowd here on the screen in front of you. But essentially, I managed to grab him on the sidelines of this and get a couple of questions exclusively, really. But talking about Samsung in particular, because if you were to see the stock chart of how Samsung has traded this year, it's slumped around 30% or thereabouts. And what's driving that is this investor concern that Samsung is missing the AI craze and the AI hype. It has lost ground to the likes of Nvidia, or SK Hynix rather, when it comes to HBM or high bandwidth memory. They are trying to push ahead and get their HBM3E technology certified. So I asked him about that timeline, when we can see their most advanced AI memory chip certified. Jensen Huang told me they're working on it as soon as possible to happen. And the market reaction today, well, some traders do seem to be liking that, or investors, because it has risen as much as 3%.
Annabelle, you're our rock star, having Jensen Huang all to yourself. Annabelle Drew lives in Hong Kong. Thank you so much for that. Now, it's been a landmark year for the crypto industry, set to be capped off with Bitcoin closing in on the watershed $100,000 level. Binance CEO Richard Tang discusses the rally following crypto supporter Donald Trump's presidential election victory.
President Trump being elected certainly give a boost and give greater clarity to this. But I will say that 2024 has been a landmark year, and that momentum started earlier this year. So if you look at what happened in January this year with Bitcoin ETF being approved, firstly in the United States and then subsequently all around the world, from Brazil to Canada to Australia, Hong Kong, and the list goes on. It gives a lot of recognition and finally the respect that this sector deserve all along. And with the likes of all the largest money manager and all the top financial institutions around the world starting to recognize the value of this space, you have Larry Finn, CEO of the largest money manager, BlackRock, in the world, that went from a crypto skeptic to a crypto believer. I think that itself speaks volume. So if you look at the Bitcoin ETF, it's the best performing ETF so far I think in the history of ETF, right? Again, it shows that institutionalization has started and mainstreaming has started.
Could the Trump administration change everything for cryptocurrencies?
Well, it's a big positive. I think the last 4 years, especially if you are in the United States, I think the last 4 years has been pretty tough, right? In terms of, regulation via enforcement, which is not necessarily the best form of regulation. But we have a very pro-crypto president. And if you look at, it's not only President Trump himself, but the House of Representatives, 2/3 of the legislator being elected are pro-crypto. Same story is happening at the Senate level. Many pro-crypto legislators and policymakers are being elected.
Binance CEO Richard Tang speaking with our colleague Francine Lacroix. Now, Hugh Chung, Chief Investment Advisory Officer of Endowus, is still with us. Apologies there, Hugh. We have Bitcoin headed towards $100,000. I mean, you got to wonder whether, institutional investors, which are not in it already, will at some point have to get into the crypto space.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating asset class, if you call it. I think what people need to understand, though, is the origin of Bitcoin. Has been a decentralized P2P, kind of asset class where no kind of government or other entity will go in and meddle with the asset class. And I think what's happened recently is that's just kind of transformed into something that's a bit more FOMO. So I think a lot of people who are getting into it don't really realize what it actually stands for. So I think I think it's a very interesting asset class, and I think for individuals there could be place in the portfolio for Bitcoin, but just to be very, very careful what you're getting into. And our stance would be that you would need to have it in moderation. It could be a store of value, such as gold, but even like gold, it doesn't have the inherent yield that it has, that other asset classes do. So it's very difficult to value the price or the right price of what it should be. So you're right, I think there are increasingly institutions trying to get into it, but it's very difficult to see what is really.
Are you already holding any cryptocurrencies in your portfolio? Or,
no.
But you're considering?
So Endowus only has unit trusts, so funds on the platform. So we don't have ETFs, we don't have single asset classes, so we don't. But in the future, we could consider if there are unit trusts that carry Bitcoin.
Let's talk about the technology space, and with that, China in particular. We've seen how Chinese tech stocks have attempted a rally. You got to wonder whether that is sustainable going forward and how you would play that.
Yeah, so China's tech stocks, if you look at Tencent and Meituan and some of these large companies, they've been kind of innovators in their own right in terms of building ecosystems within China. I think a lot of that has changed over the last few years. Obviously, it's quite sensitive to the actual consumption recovery that's in the market as well. So the Chinese government has actually, I think, changed stance in terms of policy directing at improving growth as opposed to just mitigating risk. So I think that is a positive. But like I said in my previous thing, I think it's really about earnings. So they really need to show that this will translate into earnings growth. And until we see some meaningful signs of earnings recovery, I don't think we will have as big of a jump as it used to be in the past. But it is definitely a sector where most of the really bright Chinese people are, which is a very big,
Apart from earnings, it's also about stimulus, and investors have been pretty disappointed that they've not seen a follow through. We saw how Chinese stocks slumped on Friday, and there was no national team to come in to support. And some say that is a reflection of China's hesitance to perhaps, to keep propping up the market. How do you read that?
Yeah, I think there's probably a mismatch of expectations and what can happen in the near term. I would think that next year there would continuously be follow-up stimulus to actually, prop up particularly consumption, because that's what's been, I think, missing. So I would continue to expect that to happen, but I would kind of guard against being too optimistic in terms of the near term. There's no one solution that can fix all problems.
But if you take a longer term perspective, 12, 24 months, for instance, would you be a buyer now? What would you be picking up? Where is value?
I think you still want to be investing in, companies that have its own innovation, have its own kind of path to growth, and not just reliant on stimulus, right? So, we're not experts on individual stocks, so I won't mention individual stocks, but I still think the large kind of tech companies that have that kind of moat around them is probably the ones that you want to be invested in.
How concerned are you about the potential tariffs that Trump may impose? I mean, we know that Bessent, when it comes to tariffs, he says, a gradual approach to tariffs. Is that enough to allay concerns about how the tariffs might be implemented on China?
I think, again, it's very hard to calculate the impact because there's so many different iterations. I'm not as concerned because I don't think it'll be a blind sweep way of tariffs, but also that China's probably preparing for countermeasures, and that's probably one of the reasons why it's not outright being supportive right now, because they don't know what's going to happen. The other thing that's important to note, I think, is that in the past, there were other jurisdictions like Vietnam and other countries that made the rerouting possible. And I think the government is trying to, or the US government is trying to stop that from happening as well. So this is not just a China issue. In fact, the direct issue on China may be not as, bad as feared, but the impact to other nations may be, right? So I think it's a more broad kind of situation.
All right, just before we let you go, a key conviction call for 2025. You talked about earlier how you should have a balanced portfolio, diversified portfolio.
Yeah.
But what's a must-have if you have to, choose one asset?
Well, I think I'm going to change tact a little bit. I think one thing I didn't mention today is on private equity, and it's actually related to diversification. And it's not for everyone because you have to be a professional investor and a credit investor. But I think private equity will probably come back after a few years of lull because M&A activity and IPO activity, I think, will come back with a more pro kind of corporate and lower tax policy, right? So that's something that I think people should look out for.
All right, Hugh. Thank you so much for dropping by. Hugh Chung, Chief Investment Advisory Officer of Endowus. And speaking of crypto, let's take a look where crypto currencies are trading right now. Of course, we know Bitcoin is trying to get to that 100,000 level. Not yet, but it is in positive territory, currently up by 0.8%, 97,797. Ether, not to be outdone, also in positive territory, currently up by 0.3%. So a positive day overall for asset classes today. Plenty more ahead. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.
The top names in business are on.
Welcome back. You're watching Inside. The Adani Group has released a report reassuring its creditors that it has sufficient cash flows to service its debt obligations. This is the first attempt from the group to manage the fallout from the bribery charges brought forward by U.S. authorities. Gautam Adani and his nephew Sagar Adani have reportedly been summoned by the SEC to explain the allegations. So let's get more on these latest developments with our conglomerate's media and telecom reporter PR Sanjay and government reporter Sudhi Ranjan Sen. Sanjay, let's start with you. How are the Adanis trying to calm investor nerves?
To be very honest, these credit reports are a routine publication by Adani Group since they had hit with Hindenburg crisis. So that's a fact. And this is like 6 months credit compendium where they're mentioning that they have enough cash to service all debt obligation at least for next 28 months. And they clearly said that their major revenue still deriving out of core infrastructure platform. At least 62% of the revenue is coming from there, and they are also they're claiming that they have $6.33 billion worth of cash to meet their obligations, which is rising out of imminent M&As or debt obligation or whatever liabilities they have. So they are trying to reassure the investors and other stakeholders that they have enough cash flows to service whatever debt which is coming across in their business for at least for 1 to 3 years. And they also said that they have a visibility of this kind of cash flow for next 1 decade.
So we have to wait and see how investors respond when markets are open. Sanjay, put this in perspective. What is the significance of this reported summons from the SEC for Gautam and Sagar Adani? What may happen next?
So, very interestingly, on Saturday, CFO of Adani Group, Jashinder Singh, has put out a tweet saying that this issue is all pertaining to one particular contract of Adani Green Energy Limited, which constitutes only 10% of the total revenue, total exposure of that particular company. And this is nothing to do with the listed companies, but it is something to do with founders. Of course, founders are also very critical, very key things as far as the power to port conglomerate. But what he is saying that he will seek now legal recourse, and he's also in touch with legal, US officers to get a legal advice, and they will be seeking or resorting towards a legal issue now. This is going to be a long drawn battle. It's not going to end soon. And more importantly, today Parliament session will start, and that is going to be gets more by a political mileage too.
Sudhi, let's get you into this conversation. There's been a lot of speculation over whether or not this case can be, brought forward, whether there can be progress once Trump takes office. We've been hearing from our guests on this very subject. Take a listen.
For Trump, I would think that he's not going to be inclined to be hard on Adani in that, Adani, like Trump, is the businessman. He's praised Trump. He's pledged to invest in the United States in ways that can create jobs. Those are things that I think President-elect Trump would like to hear.
So, Sudhi, the key question really is, how do you expect Trump's relationship with Modi to play into this?
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting thing because, it's a wide open field. But as we have reported, very definitely these allegations against Adani, who's supposed to be and known to be very, very close to Prime Minister Modi, and this is one of the allegations that India's opposition has been making, it's going to put to test the India-US relationship. Will President Trump go out of his way to kind of, ease the tensions and the worries for Gautam Adani? We do not know that. Similarly, it's also a question, as Indian diplomats have been pointing out, that Trump is a very transactional man. So what kind of stuff does President Trump or will President Trump expect from India in return from, for even, say, putting the case in the slow rail or putting it, in the back burner? We do not know, or whether at all he will do that. that. So these are all imponderables that, New Delhi currently is kind of weighing and trying to figure out.
Is there a sense of whether or not Prime Minister Modi has, sent out the feelers to see how Trump might respond?
Well, I mean, the analysts that we were speaking to when we were putting out our piece have a sense that it's already, it is the most likely thing that India would do is to reach out to President Trump. May not be diplomatically, may not be directly, because India, there are many other ways of reaching out to an incoming administration. But analysts who study India-US relationship very clearly feel that this has already been done. But then we do not have any clear, understanding, confirmation of that from the ground.
Sudhi, thank you so much for that. Bloomberg, Sudhi Ranjan Sen and PR Sanjay on the very latest there. For more on the fallout for US-India ties, we're joined by Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow at the Asia Research Institute. He's also a former career diplomat who served as Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations and President of the UN Security Council. Kishore, good to have you with us. I mean, how do you think Modi is looking at this indictment?
Well, I mean, as your correspondents pointed out, Prime Minister Modi is personally very close to Mr. Adani. So any shock to Mr. Adani is also going to affect him also. So I think it will lead to fairly careful calculations on the part of India as to, how much does it lean towards the US and how much does it keep its options open. And clearly, as you know, there has recently been a breakthrough in India-China relations for many, many reasons. But the fact that India managed to normalize its relations on the eve of the new Trump administration means that India is making sure that it is keeping as many options possible open when the Trump regime begins.
That's right. I mean, having relations with not just China, but also Russia, we know that it's been buying cheap Russian oil there. So, taking that into consideration, do you see that the Trump administration will be under some pressure to perhaps, to let this one go?
Well, I mean, the question, of course, is whether or not he would have the authority to do so, and whether or not he would have to pay a political price for doing so. As you know, the wheels of justice in the US can be very, very powerful. And in fact, as you know, even Donald Trump cannot escape the clutches of the courts of the United States. So it's not that easy to manipulate the US judicial process. I think you have to be realistic about that. And so the case might carry on, and then that will create certainly complications in the relations between India and the United States.
So it will be a negotiation between Modi and Trump. Would you say then China might just be the winner in this?
Well, I think I'm not so sure whether China is the winner in this, but there's no doubt that it gives, reasons for India to keep its options open vis-a-vis others, for sure, as a result of this case. We must also pay attention, Haslinda, to the sort of large-scale structural changes happening in the world order too. It's the weight of Asia overall is becoming bigger in the world. Just to give you a simple example, in the year 2000, the US economy alone was bigger than all the 52 member states of the Asian group in the UN. Amazing. But now the Asian group is 1.5 times bigger than the US economy. By 2050, it will be 3 times bigger than the US economy. So, the shift of power to Asia is still happening. And that structural force is not going to be stopped by events like this.
You talk about the weight of Asia. There's also the weight of the Adani Group, right? We have 13 ports, 7 airports, second biggest player in the cement industry in India. I mean, how might that impact how perhaps India Inc. is looked at globally?
No, I think India Inc. overall is viewed very, very positively globally. And you can see that, of course, in terms of the amount of money that is flowing into Indian equities. And Indian equities have a wonderful valuations, as you know, thanks to the global confidence in the Indian stock market. And that is, I think, going to continue, mainly because people are still very, very bullish about the prospects for the Indian economy, especially if more and more Western investment goes into India.
You know, even as we talk about how the international world is looking at this indictment, you got to wonder how it's seen internally. I mean, we have the Adanis perceived as being really close to Modi himself. And against the backdrop of how Modi lost quite a bit of votes during the election, might this be a fodder for the opposition to continue to, I guess, win more votes?
Oh, there's no question that the Indian opposition is certainly taking advantage of the situation. I think the Congress Party has stated very, very clearly that there should be independent investigations of Mr. Adani. But India, as you know, is an extremely open and democratic country. So these sorts of moves will certainly happen. Certainly the opposition will take advantage of it. But at the end of the day, it's important to emphasize that there's no one can challenge Modi's control of power. He's got a very strong coalition. There's no question he's going to last it 5 years. And he'll be able to handle these ups and downs that are coming his way.
But we have to bear in mind as well that Modi didn't get the supermajority that he wanted and that he was confident of. So he has lost some of that power. So from where you're seated, you don't see the possibility of perhaps Modi under pressure from his own BJP party, for instance, to step down?
Actually, you know what? Paradoxically, the fact that Mr. Modi did not get the supermajority may have been a gift to Mr. Modi, because it made him more aware of why he's got to be careful and realistic in the changes that he's going to try and make on various fronts, not just on the economic front, on the social front and other areas. So it's in some ways, if the fact that he didn't get the supermajority ends up making Mr. Modi more pragmatic and more realistic while in office, it may actually be good for him, because I think clearly the Indians are happy with the economic growth that he's giving to India. There's some disquiet, as you know, about his social agenda. But if the lack of a supermajority means that he's got to be more careful, then it's not a bad thing for India. It may have been the best possible result for India, showing that the Indian electorate, in a sense, made a very smart move in re-electing Modi, but without giving him a supermajority and therefore making him more pragmatic and realistic. And that could turn out to be a very good outcome for India for 5 years.
Kishore, we know that at the recent APEC meeting, we saw how China as well as India were trying to fight it out to be the leader of the global south. How do you see this playing out?
Well, I think it's not necessarily a zero-sum competition between China and India, because both, I think, clearly want to work with the global south. They realize at the end of the day, the global south makes up the vast majority of the world's population. And the global south is going to benefit from this competition. As you know, it was Prime Minister Modi who succeeded in getting the African Union admitted as a member of the G20. That's a very big deal. That gives a permanent seat to the African Union in the G20 processes. That was a gift from Mr. Modi. But at the same time, of course, if you look in terms of investments in the global south, especially in Africa and Latin America and even in Asia, Chinese investments are much, much larger because the Chinese economy is 5 times larger than the Indian economy. And what the resources that China can bring to bear, obviously, are much more. But, there's actually no harm in there being some degree of competition within China and India. In many areas, it's not a zero-sum thing because countries can have good ties with China and good ties with India, just like Singapore does.
That's right, just like Singapore. I'm just wondering, in terms of other emerging markets, how are they looking at the competition between China as well as India for that leadership position?
Well, I think it's the roles of China and India will both grow as a result of a new multipolar world that we are living in. It's a completely different, we had, as you know, the bipolar era in the Cold War. And then we had the unipolar era where the United States was clearly the dominant power with no challenger. But now we're clearly moving into a multipolar era. And the multipolar era is actually welcomed by all the new powers, including China and India, as it gives them many more opportunities in the world that we have today. So in some ways, both China and India welcome the multipolar era. And by the way, they also, in some areas, are happy to cooperate with each other. Example on climate change. China and India both believe that the Western industrial powers surely should be doing more, since a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions that we have in the atmosphere were unleashed in the Western Industrial Revolution. So they should take on more responsibility. So there are areas in which China and India are collaborating.
Kishore, thank you so much for being with us. Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow at the Asia Research Institute. Now, India's been trading for about a minute now. Let's do a check on how Adani shares are doing. They are in positive territory today, but bear in mind that the Adani Group shares have lost something like $22 billion on the back of that indictment by the U.S. Taking a look at where it is in terms of the benchmark in India, we have the Sensex also in positive territory. Adani Enterprises up at 3.5%. Adani Power up by about 2.5%. So Adani stocks pretty much in positive territory, reversing some of those losses which we saw last week. Plenty more ahead. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Inside. With India still digesting the impact of U.S. bribery charges against Gautam Adani, investors will be wondering whether it could trigger a wider loss of confidence in Indian markets or contagion for companies with close ties to the Adani empire. The stocks are up today, with Adani Enterprises making some gains. Let's discuss that with our next guest. Sonam Srivastava is founder and fund manager at Rout Research and joins us live from Mumbai. Sonam, good to have you with us. So we're seeing gains for Adani stocks pretty much across the board. Were losses overdone then?
See, I think there's a short-term relief rally that seems to be happening in the Indian market. We've seen, sharper corrections. We've gone below our 200-day moving average, and we're seeing a relief rally happen from these levels. But I think, along with the Adani issues, there are various other issues in the Indian market which are sort of stressing it. For example, there is the earnings have been quite low this season. You're seeing a slowdown in consumption demand and, deceleration of credit growth, etc. So I think while we are seeing a short-term relief, the FIIs are still not coming in. And I think we have to wait for a substantial return of the foreign capital before we say that, we're seeing a strong recovery.
But in terms of Adani shares, would you be a buyer? Would you buy the dip, given the fact that Adani shares did recover when it recovered from that Hindenburg report?
See, like many investors in India, I have burned my hands with Adani stocks a couple of times. Yeah, due to these corporate governance issues, that stocks tend to be highly volatile, and now the US, uh, government is there to sort of indict him, and it's a very serious charge. So I think we'll just stay a little bit away from these stocks, and we'll see how these things turn out, right?
How do you think the Adani indictment might impact the overall Indian market?
See, Adani definitely has a huge presence across India, right? They own very significant Indian assets. They borrowed from public sector banks and private sector banks. A lot of Indian large mutual funds have, big positions in the Adani stock. So Adani definitely does have a lot of footprint across India. And something serious happening with Adani could impact the overall market. And I think, with whatever is happening, people expect the government to also intervene, and it taking a different shape altogether from here, right?
Some are suggesting that today's rally in India is driven by the BJP's win over the weekend. It could be an indication perhaps of policy continuity, especially in the wealthier states. How are you assessing that?
No, I think there's a short-term reaction to the election results, but I think many of the analysts before the election were sort of pricing in this victory. They expected this to happen, and I think had the BJP not won, there would have been a knee-jerk reaction. So I expect again this reaction to be short-lived, and wait for some stronger cues like revival of demand in the economy, or resurgence of FII capital into the country to come back before we say that it's a sustained rally.
So now, for those wanting exposure to the Indian market, I mean, how should they be positioning themselves? What are your conviction calls?
See, in the Indian market, it's a whole range of industries, and there's so many emerging things happening. I think, so while last year was all about infrastructure and PSUs, right now the themes have really shifted. We are focusing on more defensive companies. It's obviously the pharma pack has worked well and will continue to do well. You will see resurgence in the IT segment as well. I think the earnings have been positive. There has been good guidance coming out of IT industries, and we're expecting them to be stable and have a revival. Apart from these broader themes, I think there are specific sectors in India which are quite interesting. For example, we really like the electronic manufacturing industry, especially in the consumer durable space. You're seeing very interesting stuff happening there, especially with electronic manufacturing companies like Dixon, PG Electroplast, etc. And then, I think the capital market theme in India is the theme to bet on, right? You're seeing those companies, for example, BSE, MCX, CAMS, KFintech, etc., do extremely well. And, capital market don't seem to be stopping in India, right? So these are some of the conviction calls that we sort of have.
Sonam, thank you so much for that. Sonam Srivastava, founder and fund manager at Rout Research. And before we go, let's take a look at how U.S. Treasuries are shaping up. Of course, there's been some relief in terms of the Treasury market on the back of Bessent being named, a nominee for the Treasury position. Taking a look at where we are in terms of 2-year yields, 4.3324, and 10-year yields currently at 4.3453. Well, before we go, I'll look ahead to tomorrow's program. Bank of Singapore's Chief Investment Strategist, Eli Lee, will be joining us to discuss his outlook for markets and investment strategy. That is it for Insight. Horizons Middle East and Africa is next. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.